the question of craftsmanship is very, very much in the ether at the moment, at all sorts of different levels. Among artists, debate about the importance or not of making and whether, or fabricating, and whether the artist, him or herself, should do the making. Amongst designers, the way in which small-scale, well-made objects shade into, from handmade, into industries of one, with lots of computers. Amongst craftspeople, various traditions coexisting, the legacy of the arts and crafts movement, with its strong ethical dimension, right across the spectrum to the artist craftsman, craftsperson, who isn't too worried about ethics, but wants to exhibit in galleries. So it's very much in the ether, and I want to really give a flavour of how active the debate is and how confusing it is. Snapshot number one, the language. The World Crafts Council recently suggested a range of categories within the concept of craftsman or craftsperson. And they said this, and it's like reading a speech by Polonius. It's very, very complicated. Artist craftsman, one who executes traditional designs or the designs of others. Artisan craftsman, one who executes traditional designs or the designs of others. Artist craftsman or designer craftsman, one who's capable of originating his or her own designs and who exhibits and sells them under his or her name. Designer in the craft field, one who knows the techniques in given media but prefers to design work for others rather than execute it him or herself. Rural craftsperson, etc., etc. And you get all these different categories. So within the blanket concept of craftsmanship, it really has got very, very complicated. And you get lots of prefixes: artist craftsman, designer craftsman, journeyman craftsman. Some people don't like the word craftsman at all anymore. They like workmanship. And if you go to art schools, they don't like being called craft. They call themselves applied artists, or possibly decorative artists. Think they're sidestepping the problem completely. So it's a very contested term, craftsmanship, at the moment, and I think the language actually displays that. Snapshot number two, the very broad context within which this debate is happening. I want you to imagine you're in a lecture theatre at the London School of Economics. Not easy, actually, in this setting. And the philosopher Michael Oakeshott is giving a lecture, a famous lecture in the 1950s, about the difference between knowledge and know-how. And he wants to draw attention to the fact that there's formal knowledge, the kind you get in books, the kind you get in lexicons, the kind you can learn, and there's tacit knowledge, which is the kind of knowledge you get by doing things. And he exemplifies this by making an omelette on the stage. And he's standing there, and in one hand he has the recipe book, and in the other hand he's doing all the things you need to do in order to make an omelette that aren't mentioned in the recipe book. So here we have, take 2 eggs, break them, butter, etc., etc. And here we have, you hold the frying pan by its handle, you don't put your hand in the flame, you wait until the butter is beginning to melt, etc. In other words, and he called this tacit knowledge, which is the kind of knowledge that emerges from growing within a culture. And you understand it, you don't talk about it, but you understand it by being acculturated in that culture. And here is the formal knowledge, which is the kind of knowledge you get in books. This is craft knowledge, he said, and this is formal knowledge. So that's the general area that we're talking about. And I think whatever the faction of craftspeople, they would accept that they're within the realm of tacit knowledge. Today, the jargon for it is being in the zone, which is you're making something and you get so lost in the making of it that you're in the zone. It's that area of tacit knowledge. And you can never write down, conceptually or practically, all the knowledge that's involved in any action, because so many actions involve tacit knowledge as well as formal knowledge. Snapshot number 3. The foundation of British art and design education in the first half of the 20th century, to be very broad brush about this, came from the German art school, the Bauhaus, and its curriculum. And the Bauhaus was founded in Weimar in 1919 by a bunch of architects and artists. And they announced themselves by producing an extraordinary manifesto for art education. It's been called the Handicraft Manifesto, and it had on the cover a picture of a cathedral, the Cathedral of the Arts, an expressionist woodcut by Lionel Feininger, the expressionist artist, And the idea was that the Bauhaus would become the new cathedral of the arts. And it began with a ringing clarion call. Artists, architects, sculptors, we must all return to the crafts. That unless you root things in making and actual physical contact with materials, then, he said, you're lost. Actually, that clarion call from the manifesto, we must all return to the crafts, is what it says in all the British studies of the Bauhaus. And it's been used as a catchphrase to stand against all sorts of contemporary tendencies in art, conceptual art, performance art, video art, post-Duchamp art. But actually, the phrase, we must all return to the crafts, is a mistranslation. What Gropius wrote was, we must turn to the crafts. And it's a very British thing to imagine that the future lies in the past, that we return to the crafts in order to understand contemporary art. We must turn to the crafts, meaning not some nostalgic vision of what they were once like, not a return, but a turn, like a philosophical turn in an argument, expressed in visual terms. Gropius added, the crafts must shed their traditional nature, what was holding them back, and become instead what he called speculative experience, speculative experiments, part of an experimental workshop, the laboratory of the mind. So within the Bauhaus Manifesto, particularly in its British translations, you've got this tension between whether the crafts should look backwards to the arts and crafts movement and those traditional craft skills, or whether it's a turn to the crafts. They have a contemporary role in today's society, which is living and which is experimental. So that's my snapshot number 3. Snapshot number 4, I'll get to the pictures soon. The current debate in the literature, which is very much about a turn to the crafts rather than a return to the crafts. Professor Matthew Crawford, who's an American philosopher who also runs a motorcycle repair shop, has recently published an impassioned book that actually became a rather surprising bestseller, The Case for Working with Your Hands, or Why Office Work is Bad, 2009, which argues the morality of getting one's hands dirty by actually making and fixing things, an argument which tries hard to avoid, as he puts it, the precious images of manual work which intellectuals sometimes traffic in. Are people less likely to throw things away in these recessional days? What about our frugal future? Has the knowledge economy idea been overdone? Have we become too reliant on financial services? I won't go into all this, by the way. The book does. What about the things you can't get on the internet, like hammering a nail or driving a screw? The things that have to be performed in person, the things that can't be flown over from China. What about those? And he argues the case for working with your hands. Meanwhile, and funnily enough, copies of this book, I can say from personal experience, were circulating in the cabinet 2 or 3 years ago. It made a big, big impact on thinking about education, for example. Meanwhile, the British philosopher Alain de Botton has assembled The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work, 2009, a collage of examples around the question, when does a job feel meaningful? And the New York-based sociologist Richard Sennett, in The Craftsman, a rather wonderful book that's come out in Penguin, Richard Sennett, The Craftsman, 2008, has examined the desire to do a job well for its own sake, from all sorts of perspectives, as the characteristic that distinguishes us from other life forms, the desire to do a job well for its own sake. He's convinced that the desire resides in all of us. So craftsmanship's definitely being debated at the moment as an idea right to be reclaimed. It's just that the language is very confusing and no one quite knows what craftsmanship is. The word crafts itself hasn't really changed. I mean, recently there's been these huge changes in the vocabulary of the arts. I remember when I was chairing the Arts Council how the arts had become culture and how taste had become excellence. And there were all sorts of changes going on in the vocabulary which are very significant in themselves. I mean, culture sounds much more democratic than the arts. So we're all doing culture, etc. But the crafts remained the crafts with their Polonius-like array of prefixes, artist, craftsman, designer, applied artists, etc. A sure sign that the word is now beginning to cause embarrassment. The common sense definition of the word craft seems clear enough. An activity which involves skill in making things by hand, derived from the Old English craft, meaning strength or skill. But on closer inspection, the word becomes more and more difficult to pin down. Big manufacturers like to promote their wares with the language of craft. You'll have noticed that huge mass-manufactured objects are handmade, hand-finished. The potato crisps you eat are hand-cooked, made by our craftsmen, uniquely for you. A cousin to the word organic, which is equally abused in marketing terms. So the craft, it's assumed that consumers feel good about the craft, so you use the word a lot, but it rather debases the coinage. To a sociologist, the word craft means skilled manual labour. To a countryman, it means traditional rural pursuits. To a trade unionist, it means a community of skilled people defending the way they perform their occupations, usually in industry, craft unions. To a laboratory scientist, with the use of equipment to do science. To an art critic, particularly a fashionable one, the word craft is about the distinction between art as an intellectual, conceptual occupation and mere craft as in manual skill, which is a debased version of age-old debates about the social recognition of the artist, which go back to the Italian Renaissance. But that's a big subject. On this one, Turner Prize winner and now CBE Grayson Perry recently delivered a showstopper. I think the art world had more trouble coming to terms with me being a potter than with my choice of frocks. If you call your pot art, you're being pretentious. If you call your shark art, you're being philosophical. To educationalists, on the other hand, the word's associated with learning by doing, experiential learning, rather than learning from books. And it's a big subject, but I've always argued that the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, if you actually follow through the origin of that phrase, the 3 R's, and it's been traced back to the mid-18th century. Originally, the 3 R's were reading, writing, and arithmetic. Literacy, making things, numeracy, as the great triangle at the basis of any good learning. But the writing disappeared in the era of Mr. Gradgrind in the mid-19th century, and it became literacy, numeracy, reading, writing, both literacy and numeracy. In other words, it's the 2 R's. That's another story. But it's a big debate within education. And if someone were to approach you and to ask you, what do you make? And you were to reply, I make things, and I make them as well as I can, chances are the questioner would be at a loss for words, because the question, what do you make, always means how much do you earn and how big your bonus is. At the same time, the word product is changing very dramatically from meaning the dictionary definition, a thing assembled or manufactured, to meaning a bundle of services. For example, if you go to a travel agent, you'll see some products, or parking products as you park your car, or insurance products, or investment products, etc. In other words, the word product is changing its meaning to a bundle of services attached to anything that's produced by any means that's brought together rather than a thing manufactured. So in that sort of world, the crafts are a very contested area. Snapshot number 5. Developments, this is where the pictures are going to start in a minute, not quite yet. Developments within the British crafts themselves in the 20th century. I'm going to do a very broad brush history. The story, I think, of the modern crafts begins with the arts and crafts movement. I noticed you got some lovely Pugin and references to Ruskin and so on in the glass case. The story begins with the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, which in my view made the crafts visible and gave them value for the first time in art history. Up to the mid-18th century, they were just the way you made things, and they were valued as such, and they were never discussed as a separate concept. If you look at the mid-18th century encyclopedia in France, it's all what we would call crafts, but they called it manufacturing. In the late 19th century, they were no longer the way in which things were made, predominantly, and the arts and crafts movement only made sense in relation to mass manufacture, or rather in relation to steam-powered handwork. As a criticism, as an exemplar, as an alternative, as well-made rather than shoddily made, as an alternative to the high street. And the movement and its accompanying theories by Ruskin and Morris and Pugin had all sorts of global connections as well, with folk traditions of other cultures, with Eastern religions, with literary myth cycles, and it didn't all go one way. You have Bernard Leach turning to Japan and Korea, you have Michael Cardew, the potter, turning to Africa, but it did go the other way as well. Ethel Mere, the weaver, actually taught Gandhi how to weave on a hand loom, and that became very important in the movement for Indian nationalism. And if I could be allowed a tiny moment of autobiography. When I was 7 years old, I was at a school near Ditchling, and we all walked crocodile fashion to visit a very elderly lady who lived in a bungalow called Gospels in Ditchling, who taught us all how to weave. And this is one of my treasured possessions, is a mat that I wove at that time. And it turns out that the lady was Ethel Mere in her 80s, the woman who in the 1920s had taught Gandhi how to spin. I didn't realise, all I thought at the time was she was a rather fearsome person who kept criticising me, and it's a terrible piece of work, but never mind, it means a lot to me. And it's one of those seeds that are planted that stay with you forever. The long-term, Morris has been called, in Nicholas Pevsner's book, the pioneer of modern design, a pioneer of modern design. I would argue that he was much more importantly a pioneer of modern craft. The long-term legacy of this movement was a popular image of the crafts which survived right through to the 1970s and in some cases still does. If you'd asked a purchaser or an exhibitor or a curator or a maker about the crafts and about skill at that time, roughly from the 1890s through to the 1970s, the following list would have emerged. Crafts must be made of natural materials, preferably in beige. Crafts must be functional. Crafts must be the work of one person, perhaps featuring visible thumbprints to prove it. Crafts must be the embodiment of a traditional design. Crafts must be in the artisan rather than the art tradition. Crafts must be rural. Crafts must be untouched by fashion. Crafts must be easily understood. Crafts must last, like a brogue shoe or a fine tweed. Crafts must be affordable. Now this is slightly controversial because, of course, in the case of Morris and Co., affordable mainly by Oxbridge colleges and well-endowed churches. I mean, they were very expensive, but this was one of their mantra. But above all, and this I think relates to today's theme, the crafts must provide a solace in a rapidly changing world. They must make you feel better about modernisation. And that was absolutely at the heart of the arts and crafts philosophy. And they must be about memory embodied in objects. And there's a wonderful quote to illustrate that from D.H. Lawrence's poem, Things Men Have Made, which you may know. It's all about a Navajo rug. And this, I think, expresses that thought very well about crafts as memory embodied in objects. Things men have made with wakened hands and put soft life into are awake through years with transferred touch and go on glowing for long years. Excuse me. And for this reason, some old things are lovely, warm still with the life of the forgotten men who made them. That was absolutely at the heart of this definition of the crafts. But in the 1970s, let's have the first slide. Sorry, yes, very good. To illustrate that philosophy of the crafts, a brisk arts and crafts and its legacy. That common sense definition. Thank you. This is Walter Crane's writings. He was the director of the Royal College in 1896 onwards, and one of the theorists of the arts and crafts movement. Yep, next one please, and an educator. Walter Crane's dado of the year that he took over the Royal College. Next slide. William de Morgan, ceramics. Next one. Chintz, Tulip and Willow by Morris, 1873. Next one. Part of this was a celebration of the rural crafts, and there was a huge cult in the late 19th, early 20th century of the Windsor chair, this bentwood chair made in the forests near Windsor. We'll come back to that. Next, please. The legacy. The famous underground fabric by Enid Marks. I'm sure you've all sat on these, on London buses and undergrounds. The legacy of the arts and crafts movement. Next one. There used to be a very fine organisation in Bath called the Crafts Study Centre, which was devoted to the work of the interwar craftspeople, the next generation of the arts and crafts movement. They've now moved to Farnham, but here's one of the wonderful exhibits, Barron and Larcher, hand-block printed textiles of the 1930s. It's a sample book. on the left on linen and on the right on cotton, the same print, hand block printed. Next slide. Collection of ceramics, there's cardews, leeches, hamadas. It's that tradition of studio pottery, the legacy of the arts and crafts movement. Next slide. Sorry to be so brisk, but they've only given me 40 minutes. This is Ethel Meres, I mentioned her earlier, a collection of braiding, partly from Africa, partly from the former Yugoslavia. Next slide. Back one, sorry. The Windsor chair, the traditional bent wood chair made in the forests of Windsor originally. Next slide. This is one of the very early examples from the 18th century, before it became a bent wood back. Next slide. And here, from the 1970s, is Richard Bateman's sculptural version of the Windsor chair. And it's that turning point that let's leave that one up and move on to the 1970s, when the crafts, like everything else, changed or evolved into something very different. Definitions of skill as something static, or of the crafts as confined to a particular medium or approach, were up for grabs. Graduates from art schools were more likely to set up a studio and to try and work for themselves as studio craftspeople, rather than to engage directly with industry, even to criticise it, and they wanted to sign their work. A survey of 20,000 working craftspeople at this time, in the early 70s, called Working in Crafts, sponsored by the relatively new Crafts Council, concluded that the attractions were the way of life, control at the point of production, being in control of your life, and that the average disposable income of the 20,000 craftspeople surveyed was £4,300. In other words, you've got to really love that way of life in order to make any kind of a living at it, usually teaching for 1 or 2 days a week and so on. Ethics weren't top of the agenda anymore, as we'll see. Now, if you'd asked a practitioner or exhibition goer or curator in the late 70s, the list would probably, I think, have looked like this. Crafts can be made with synthetic materials in all colours of the rainbow. Crafts can be made with machines and maybe even by them if computer technology develops in the way that it is. Crafts can be non-functional, and I love this. David Pye, a great craftsman who wrote a book called The Nature and Art of Workmanship, said people asked him for a definition of the crafts and the definition of art. His definition of art was the American Customs and Excise definition of art, that if you're trying to import or export a work of art, you have to fill in a form and you have to say it's absolutely useless. Yeah. Crafts can be made in limited production. Crafts can be designed by one person and made by another. Crafts can provide designed prototypes for industry. Crafts can be made in towns and cities, and in fact they usually are. Crafts can be high fashion and still be well made, although they needn't be. Crafts can use ideas borrowed from the fine arts of painting and sculpture. Crafts can be transient or they can be lasting. It's up to them. Crafts can be very expensive indeed, but as we've seen, William Morris was as well. Above all, the role of the crafts is no longer to provide a solace, but to provide a challenge, often by means of an ironic statement about traditional notions of the crafts. To give you an idea, there's a lot of work in the 70s and 80s around feminism and the crafts, which is getting at the masculinity of the original arts and crafts movement in all sorts of different ways. You can use old materials, you can use new materials. For the first time in the history of the crafts since the late 19th century, an avant-garde had emerged within the crafts. And as one rather waspish reviewer said, it's all very well to have an avant-garde, but why can't we have a well-designed fireguard? That would be rather nice as well. Anyway, so let's have a look at some slides. Yeah. Okay, so the way in which manufacturers use the language and imagery of the crafts. Next slide. This is mass-manufactured furniture using the image of the craftsperson doing the finishing in the workshop, with all sorts of pictures of the wood bodgers of the Windsor forests in order to market a mass-manufactured chair. Next slide. Yes, this is interesting. I wanted to sort of complicate this picture about the arts and crafts movement. This is Edward Johnston, one of his teaching aides for teaching calligraphy in the 1920s. And it's very easy to mock the arts and crafts for not being modern enough in its orientation. But next slide, please. Of course, Johnston goes home in the evening and designs the underground sign, the famous underground sign, this moment where it turns into the famous one with the tunnel and the train going through it. So in the daytime he's doing calligraphy. He was a very monkish character actually, but then in the evening he said, my concession to Mammon was to design this iconic modern design for the London Underground. I just wanted to complicate the picture by putting those in. Yes, next slide please. Chairs by Richard Bateman, 1988, white and black oak. Next slide. Right. Robert Dawson, modern joke about willow pattern. Basically, these are plates made in 1994-5 which take the willow pattern, deconstruct it, turn it into bits, and represent it. So this is the kind of ironic use of the craft. Next slide. This was extraordinary. It was an exhibition at the Royal College, and this is Morris's wallpaper. But we stood there looking at it, and a little mouse came out and started walking along this and it's animated William Morris wallpaper, which you can now do with a computer, very, very thin. And I thought I was going mad, actually, because all sorts of things, and a cherry falls down from above, and all sorts of things. Only it happens very, very slowly, and you can't believe your eyes. It's sort of taking the mickey out of Morris, but turning him into an animated cartoon. But rather alarmingly, I discovered that the NHS has actually commissioned this chap for doctors' waiting rooms to have animated wallpaper. I think if you're not feeling poorly, you certainly will be. Anyway, there we are. Next slide, please. These are... Actually, have you missed one out? In between? No? Okay. Stacking chairs, 1983, by Floris van den Broek. Next one. Elizabeth Fritsch, ceramics. This is interesting because these are based on Renaissance paintings, the colours of Renaissance paintings, and they're beautiful pots when photographed from the front, but they breach all the arts and crafts principles because they don't have sides, and it's like ceramic as a canvas, and so the side is a sort of strip, so it doesn't work in the round at all. They're made to be seen from the front like a painting and to be photographed from the front. That's a very good example, I think, of the modern crafts. Next slide. This is Liz Fritsch as well. A piece she made in the early 1980s. Next slide. That's her as well. These, by the way, are from a rather interesting exhibition at the Ruffin Craft Gallery in Denbighshire, which looked at the tradition of the 1970s craftspeople and how they... where they are today. It was about, called the Age of Experience, and what happened to those avant-garde people of the 70s as they became the establishment. Next slide. This is Sven Bayer, who was one of the early ceramicists. Next. Wally, they're all in a funny order. Sorry. David Drew, baskets. From the he's been working since the 1970s in artist basket making. Next slide. Close up. Yep, thanks. Peter Collingwood, wall hangings. Yeah. You can always hear the arts and crafts people spinning when you see these because they have absolutely no function. Next slide, except to be beautiful, which itself is a function. This is a close-up of Wally Keeler, wrought iron teapot. Next slide. Also Wally Keeler. Mary Restio, iCat weaving, a traditional technique used in a very painterly modern way. Next slide. Let's keep that on. Okay, so I think you get the picture and the change, I hope you do, from the arts and crafts to the modern craftsperson. It's a very, very different thing. So what if one was going to compile such a list for today? How would those issues have changed? Obviously, at one end of the spectrum, the interface between the crafts and fine art have become very interesting, particularly in the era of conceptual art, as we'll see. But today's list would also be to do with design and the role of computer technology in the development of the crafts, so-called industries of one. And the relationship between the crafts and digital technology is important. But the the consistent feature would be what makes the crafts, what distinguishes them and makes them highly visible is the care with which they've been made, the fact they've been made by one human being for another, the individual take, the use of materials and the thoughtfulness of their design. It's sort of design with attitude. They can make an ethical statement, but they needn't. And all those categories I mentioned at the beginning, artist, craftsman, designer, craftsman, etc., are now, I think, seen as a range of possibilities rather than as inhibitors. The crafts are a spectrum, and the more inclusive and versatile, the better. Final snap. Let's have a look at some. Oh no, sorry. Keep that. Yeah, thanks. Final snapshot: the role, position, and status of the crafts within fine art today. In the David Hockney landscape exhibition, A Bigger Picture, at the Royal Academy, which some of you may have seen a couple of years ago, there was a caption which attracted an unusual amount of attention. Amidst the many oil paintings, watercolours, drawings, films, and iPad sketches, it simply said, all the works were made by the artist himself, personally. And it caused a sensation. There were articles about it. Why is he saying that? Why does he have to say that? What point is he making? And he was interviewed, Hockney was interviewed, and he said rather defensively, it wasn't intended as a reference to any particular artist. Everyone thought he was putting Damien Hirst down. It wasn't intended as a reference to any particular artist, but the statement was intended as a joke, but it did have a serious point behind it. In art education, he explained, they used to teach the craft and left the poetry up to the individual, whereas today they try to teach the poetry and completely ignore the craft.
Yeah.
This left young artists without the technical skills to express their own ideas. How can a student master the language of painting, he said, if paint is the chosen medium, unless she understands the grammar? How do you use a language until you understand the grammar? The visual arts, Hockney implied, were actually unique in this respect, because deep learning was still at the root of any education in music, composition, dance, drama, and singing. But within the visual arts, it was different. And this debate, which was much more than a spat between two celebrity artists, followed hot on the heels of a series of fascinating London exhibitions in autumn 2011, which raised similar questions. There was Grayson Perry's Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman, 2012, at the British Museum, which interspersed artefacts from the museum's collection with Perry's pots and concluded with the thought that even today, I quote, it is important to have a long and sympathetic hands-on relationship with materials, a relaxed, humble, ever-curious love of stuff. Critic Brian Sewell in the Evening Standard, and we haven't always got on, interpreted this in characteristically robust terms as a polemic about the old distinction between an art and a craft. He wrote, "Pottery is only pottery, the craftsman's stuff of the kitchen and the cabinet of curiosities, and never to be mistaken for art. One might well preserve pickled herrings in a Perry pot, drown a Duke of Clarence, or even pee in it, none of which things can be done with Michelangelo's David." Well, I think we can agree with that. But actually, Grayson Perry was not making, I think, that point. He was on a different tack and a more significant one. The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman was, at one level, to stop and take a closer look at all those anonymous objects, shrines, relics, tapestries, maps, pilgrimage souvenirs, sacred sculptures, and other man-made wonders of the world, as he put it, which belong to a more spiritual age. It was also about a related theme, how art galleries and museums have become the new sacred spaces, where people behave in silent, reverential ways, and where original exhibits in their glass cases take on a secular kind of aura. Increasingly, this encourages the spectator and the spectacular rather than the humble. It also leads to the ubiquitous use of the word iconic. But above all, The Unknown Craftsman was a sustained response to the fashionable thesis distilled in a recent book by a man called Michael Petrie, The Art of Not Making, the New Artist-Artisan Relationship. That since the days of Marcel Duchamp's Urinal, roughly from 1917 onwards, serious avant-garde art has utterly separated itself from its fabrication. Art is named as art. It's art if I say it's art. And someone else who is expert at that sort of thing makes it become real. The role of the artist is to think, to conceive ideas, and to delegate the making to artisans. Hence the phrase conceptual art. And this is not at all the same thing as the division of labour in a Renaissance workshop, although it's often claimed to be, at the dawn of the art-craft distinction, when the artist created the overall design, employed assistants to paint some of the details, and then completed the work of art himself. A very different thing to delegating the whole process to an artisan. The workshop as communal space, with the artist leading from the front. Not the same, because post-Duchamp, the think work and the do work have become completely separated. And most of the conceptual artists simply don't possess the skills to embody their ideas. At the same time, the V&A put on an exhibition called The Power of Making. I was very involved in this one, also 2012. And the title was a deliberate reply to Petrie's book, The Art of Not Making. This is The Power of Making, which looked at how, once the processes of making have shed their nostalgic associations, once the long shadows of the arts and crafts movement and of the hard-won image have been exorcised, they will have a strong relevance to the post-industrial world, at a time when fewer people know how to make the things they use than ever before in history. To put over this point, the exhibition included David Mack's Gorilla, made entirely of coat hangers, videos about the thrill of being in the zone by doing something really well, and a chair made of polyester and fiberglass. Let's have a brisk look at this exhibition, which was very, very popular, The Power of Making. You can see the range. Yeah, a saddle, a strange robot. Next slide. All of these things were handmade. It was trying to say you don't have to be a Leach or a Morris. You can actually get engaged in these sort of areas as well. Next slide. Yeah. That's the coat hanger gorilla. I mean, you might say, why do it? That's another question. Yeah, okay. This is a spun chair by Ron Arad. And this is a handmade bicycle. That's it. Yeah? Okay. The debate about artist and artisan, concept and fabrication, poetry and craft, usage and grammar, has been around in one form or another for a very long time. In its current incarnation, it dates back to the late 1910s. Those who argue for the importance of technical skills in education and in professional practice are routinely accused of coming over all conservative, the sorts of commentators who think any avant-garde art practice since Duchamp is still part of the shock of the new. I mean, in 3 years' time, ladies and gentlemen, the urinal will be celebrating its centenary. And yet, when there are major exhibitions raising precisely these questions at the Royal Academy, the British Museum and the V&A, all in the same season, and when leading philosophers and sociologists start writing about the craftsman and the case for making with your hands, the question has absolutely re-entered the ether, is alive and well and being posed with increasing urgency. There seems to be an unease about the new division of mental and manual labour, and a desire not to be categorised as a fuddy-duddy conservative for expressing it. Maybe we need a new vocabulary and contemporary ways of expressing what are, in my view, genuine anxieties and speculations about what the next chapter in the story might be. Thank you very much.